Hi, my name's Des Cowley and I'm the Principal Librarian of History of the Book and Arts at State Library Victoria. Today, as part of our Collecting Conversations series, we're going to delve into an area of book history that we refer to as Marginalia. Now joining us is Dr. Anna Welch, Senior Librarian of History of the Book and Arts. Anna is a book historian with a PhD in the field of medieval manuscripts, and she has an ongoing fascination with marginalia in books. Welcome, Anna, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Des, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Now, to start us off, and to paraphrase the writer Raymond Carver, what do we talk about when we talk about marginalia?
Well, marginalia has sort of two meanings that are related but a little distinct, and we're going to look at both kinds today. It sort of, as a literal translation, it means things that are in the margins, so something that's added to the margin of a text. And that could be annotations that are added by a reader, but it's also used to refer to the sort of funny snails and monsters that we find in medieval manuscripts, which haven't been added in. They were part of the original concept of the decoration for the book. So, I mean, what's so lovely about marginalia in both those forms is that it gives us a really personal glimpse of people interacting with books, and a kind of more humorous and light-hearted look at the way medieval people read their books.
Now, what are some of the common things that people actually write in their books?
Well, probably one of the most common things, and something that we've all done, I'm sure, is that people write their names in their books. And this is really helpful to book historians because it allows us to trace where a book's been over time, who's owned it, to follow the story of its provenance. So it's often a really interesting aspect in particular about for historians to follow women's readership, women's book ownership. And we've got a really lovely example of that from our collection. This is a copy of Philip Sidney's poem Arcadia, published, this is a 1628 edition of that poem. And it's been owned, or certainly it's fallen into the clutches at some point, of a little girl called Anne Mansell. And she's written her name over and over again in the front, inside the front cover of this book, but she's also started to compose a letter to her mother. And so she's kind of practicing her handwriting in this book. And she writes, "Dear mother, I received your letter and tokens, and for them I give you many thanks for them." So she's practicing her letters, practicing her writing, and it's a sort of quite evocative glimpse into the life of that book and its relationship for one particular girl at a point in time.
And now, following on from young Anne, we all know that kids love to scribble in books, and we're often horrified when we actually come across this, especially, in fact, if it's a library book. Should we be horrified?
This brings us to a quite delicate part of our conversation about marginalia, because of course, as a book historian, I love it when people write in their books, including children, but as a librarian, I have to plead that people please don't write in library books. Just write in your own books, and then we hope that one day they'll end up in the collections of institutions like the State Library of Victoria. But yes, children scribbling in books is quite an instinctive thing, and that's a really lovely window onto the way in which marking our books as we read them is something that comes very naturally to us from a very young age, from as soon as we start actually interacting with books. And it's also a nice form of marginalia, because it's not necessarily about writing words into a book, into the margins. It can be about adding drawings. And we have a really beautiful example of that in the collection, which is a copy, a 1585 edition of Terence's comedies, Terence, the Roman author. And his writings were often used to teach Latin in the early modern period, because his Latin was very nice and clear and easy to follow, so it was good for teaching children. And in this particular copy, we can see one little boy who draws himself and gives his name as Stephen in the classroom, and he's drawn a few little sort of vignettes from his day in the schoolroom. We see his teacher ringing the bell, probably to start the class. We can see his teacher standing at a lectern that has books on it, and we can also see Stephen himself with another little figure who he's named as his little brother. And it is a little alarming that Stephen's holding a sword there, so we can only hope that the younger brother escaped the schoolroom unscathed.
Now, one of the other things we find is that readers often annotate their own comments into books that they're reading. or they might highlight or underline passages. What might such marks actually tell us?
Well, I think this is probably one of the most exciting types of marginalia for researchers, because it helps us get a really good sense of exactly how people are reading. And the history of reading is something that's become a sort of popular topic amongst historians in the last few decades. And it also, this category of marginalia includes probably one that would be top of lots of people's lists of favourite things you can find in a book, which is the manicule. And the manicule is a little hand that's used as a kind of, almost as a post-it note, pointing at significant parts of the text. It's a way that people could mark a passage that they wanted to come back to, something that was important to them in the book. And the manicule goes back at least into the 12th century, if not before then, and it's still used today. I'm sure if people go out and have a look at, particularly in advertising, you'll spot the use of a hand pointing at text pretty frequently, still in our modern world. And we've got an example that we've picked for our talk today, which is from a 14th century, early 15th century English medical manuscript. And you can see he's got rather a jazzy little cuff, which is quite stylish. And another nice example of personal commentary that I thought would be good for us to talk about today is from a book that was actually owned by Redmond Barry, who founded State Library of Victoria in 1854 and several other major institutions aside from that in Melbourne. And his personal library wasn't kept together, but we do have a number of his books in the State Library's collection, which we know are his because of his book plate and his name appears in the book. And this particular one is one that's a title called The Anatomy of Drunkenness, published in 1832. And Redmond Barry has seized on one particular passage, which is about how when people are drunk, they become quite pompous and their conversation is less interesting than it would be if they were slightly more sober. And it's reminded him of a passage from Shakespeare's Othello. And so he's noted that in the margin, and he's actually then gone, I suppose this is the sign of someone who really was a passionate reader. He's gone and written in the passage that he was thinking of from Othello, which is pretty good. So I'll just read it out. It says, "Drunk and speak parrot and squabble, stagger, swear, and discourse fustian with one's own shadow. O thou invisible spirit of wine, if thou hast no name to be known by, let us call thee devil." So he's making his thoughts known about what it's like to talk to drunk people. And it's a really nice example of a reader, responding to a text and then connecting it to other things that he's reading, other texts that mean something to him.
I know Redmond Barry was a great annotator of his own books, but as well as adding notes to a text, we also come across books where readers have actually crossed passages out. And I love those, exclamation marks against a kind of passage you find in the margins. It's as if they're actually having a running argument with the author.
Absolutely. I think, seeing that kind of dialogue, that debate that goes back and forth between author and reader is a really satisfying aspect of studying marginalia. And there's of course the other aspect of that is that at times marginalia sort of veers into actual censorship of texts when texts are altered in a systematic way. And probably the most famous example of that, which we have a great copy of in our collection, is Nicholas Copernicus's work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. And this was the text which was first published just before Copernicus himself died in 1543. And it was the text in which he articulated his belief in a heliocentric universe with the sun at the center. And of course that turned thousands of years of belief on its head, because formerly, going right back to the ancient Greeks, people had conceived of the universe as geocentric with the earth at the center. And that became very important in a Christian worldview, because it accords with the story of creation that you find in the book of Genesis in the Bible, that the earth is at the center of God's creation and humankind is therefore at the center of God's creation. And so the publication of this book was extremely contentious, and this was at the beginning of the period of the sort of index of banned books, that the church began to censor works that it deemed to be sort of antithetical to its system of belief. And Copernicus's work was singled out for this treatment, it wasn't that they tried to destroy the book, but they stipulated that all the existing copies needed to be altered so that the text would appear to be a theory and hypothetical rather than a provable fact. And so we have a fantastic copy of the second edition, which shows these marks of alteration. And I think, you can kind of consider this a form of marginalia, the additions to the text, but also the crossing out of the words. And it's a great example too of how important marginalia can be. Back in the 1970s, an American scholar called Owen Gingerich started to conduct a census of all the known surviving copies of Copernicus's work in order to study their alteration, to study the impact of the church's censorship. And he did in fact study our copy also. And from that work, he was able to determine that although we have this concept of the Roman Church at that time as all powerful, in fact, the further away from Rome that a copy of this book was, the less likely it was to have been altered. So marginalia in that case has given us a really new understanding and a more nuanced understanding of a fascinating period of the past.
Now, the production of books in that period was a fairly messy business, whether we're talking about manuscripts or early printed books. Do evidential traces that might speak to a book's production, even accidental ones, count as marginalia?
Well, I like to think that they do, because they're another form of alteration of a text, an addition to something around the edges of a text. And sometimes these ones can be the most evocative. And a lovely example that came to mind in this kind of category is a fingerprint that we find in a devotional text that was published in 1531 in England. And it was published by Wynkyn de Worde, who famously, apart from having probably the greatest name in publishing history, was the protege of William Caxton, who had been the person that brought printing to England, having learned it on the continent. And this fingerprint is in printer's ink. It's that sticky, viscous kind of ink that printers use. And it's clearly an accidental mark on the page. And there's no way that we can tell whether or not this is Wynkyn's own fingerprint, but whoever's it is, it's a little fragment of a life that otherwise might be unrecorded.
Now, look, some of the quirkiest types of marginalia that we find are those in medieval manuscripts. There are lots of monks behaving badly, there are killer rabbits and birdmen, and they love nothing more than a good fart joke. And what's going on with those snails?
Well, I wish I could explain the snails to you, but I mean, that would be a whole talk in its own right, because in fact there's a lot of sort of debate about what the snails actually mean, and probably they mean more than one thing. But yes, exactly, medieval marginalia is probably the most popular form. Certainly it's something that we can all appreciate and enjoy. These are really interesting forms of decoration within this period, because they give us a great insight into how differently medieval people saw the place of the text in their lives from what we might expect from our modern kind of sometimes quite black and white thinking, that you find these very rude things happening in the margins of religious manuscripts, spiritual texts, and that to us can be quite a shocking contrast, but it goes some way to helping us understand better the mindset of the people that produced it, where there wasn't such a sharp distinction between secular and spiritual kind of concerns. So there's a few different kinds of marginalia even within this category. Sometimes you find things that are just purely humorous and quite silly and don't seem to have a direct connection to what's written in the text in the centre. And some examples of that we have, I've chosen, all these examples come from one manuscript, which is a book of hours, a personal prayer book that was made around about the year 1490, somewhere in the southern Netherlands. And it's a book that was made for a secular person to use, not for a nun or a monk. And it's the prayers that you would read and recite at set times of the day. This book has some really excellent marginalia, and it's got a lot of snails. So I did pick one just for you, Des. He's got a hat on. He's looking lockdown ready. I think lots of people are wearing hats to cover up our lockdown hairdos. There's also wonderful little faces drawn into the drawn by the scribe into some of the larger letters, which are you know, a whole area of study in their own right. They almost seem like portraits, these particular faces in this manuscript, because they're so specific, the features. The margins in a medieval manuscript were also used to kind of make particular commentary on the text. So even though at first glance, something that's happening in the margins, and even the fact that it's in the margins, and to us that means it's sort of on the edge, it's not necessarily relevant. That's how, you know, when we talk about things being marginalized, we mean that they're on the fringes and not kind of participating in the central conversation. But in these cases, in medieval books, you find kind of the opposite, that the margin is a space that's still very much involved in what's happening in the book, but because it is on the edges, it's a kind of free space. It's somewhere where you can be playful, where you don't have to follow exactly a kind of formal engagement with the text. And my favorite example from this book is this wonderful page where you find there's two things happening in the margins. The text, though, is the beginning of the penitential psalms, and these are the readings that are about expressing sorrow for having committed sins. So you look around the edges of this page and you see down below there's a man wrestling a lion, and he's wrenched the lion's head open, he's grabbed its tongue. He looks something like Hercules, you know, wrestling this lion. And you think in the context of what the text is, oh, maybe the lion represents sin and he's conquered his sins. But actually the lion in the medieval tradition was used as an allegory for Christ for a few different reasons, but one of the more colourful being that lion cubs were believed to be born dead, and then 3 days after birth to be brought to life by either the mother or either the lion or the lioness roaring over the lion cubs, and this resurrected them in the same way that Christ was resurrected 3 days after his death. So the lion is a figure for Christ, and in that context, you see this is actually quite subversive what's happening in this image, that a human sinner is kind of wrestling and besting Christ. And it gets kind of even funnier when you look up the top, you see another kind of flip on this imagery, that now we have not a lion but a cat, a domestic cat who's clothed in the habit of a nun. So there's a humorous kind of maybe poking fun at people in religious orders, poking fun even slightly perhaps at Christ, but within the context of a book that is made for a serious purpose. It is about the salvation of the reader's soul. So that, you know, these are deliberately absurd and funny, and for that reason, you know, we love to explore this kind of marginalia.
So I have to ask you, in that case, do you have your own favourite piece of marginalia in the library's collection?
That's a very tough question. The cat nun would be right up there, followed by a few snails. But I did think of one in particular that I think has a really beautiful sentiment that I imagine resonates certainly for me and for a lot of us, particularly at the moment. This is a book of spiritual texts from 1648, and it's part of our John Emerson collection. And someone has written on the inside, on the flyleaf of the book, a little sentence in Latin, and it translates as, "I sought rest and found it nowhere unless I was in a little nook with a little book." So I think that's something probably that we can all relate to a bit at the moment.
That's a perfect way to end. Now, I'd like to thank you, Anna, for this insight into marginalia found in books. And I suspect we'll think twice in future when we come across a child writing a book. Who knows? Perhaps future historians will glean all sorts of information about our time from those innocent marks. Which is why projects, in fact, such as memorybank are so important. And it's why we're inviting the public to help us build an archive of our time for the future. Please do visit the library's website and consider joining our Facebook group to engage with your fellow citizen collectors.